Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues and friends, a very warm welcome to the Center for Social Sciences and Humanities, the CSH. This evening we are extremely pleased to welcome Professor François Bourguignon from Collège de France for a very particular evening. Indeed, this is the official India launch of his latest book, The Globalization of Inequalities, published with Princeton University Press. Before I give the floor to Professor Bourguigon for the presentation of his book, let me maybe tell you a few things about our work with the Collège de France and the Collège de France itself. As you may know, the Collège de France is an extremely old and reputed French institution. It's a 500 years old French institution, which has seen Henri Bergson, Michel Foucault, Claude Lévi-Strauss, among many other extremely famous professors. It is today directed by Serge Haroche, the French Nobel Prize 2012 in physics. And very interestingly, it's a very multidisciplinary research institution, as all fields of science are represented, from literature to social sciences and art, or hard sciences, if I may say. Something I find also extremely fascinating with Collège de France is that the courses are open to all. So all people, all individuals interested in a given topic just come and listen to a given class. We have an agreement with Collège de France and the scientific department of the French embassy in Delhi, in India, and together we are organizing a number of lecture series. Now let me introduce Professor François Bourguignon himself. François Bourguignon is Emeritus Professor of Economics at the Paris School of Economics, holding an annual chair now at the Collège de France. He has been the director of the Paris School of Economics from 2007 to 2013. Before that, he was the chief economist and senior vice president of the World Bank in Washington. And he spent before the rest of his career with the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris. He's a specialist in public economic policy, income distribution and inequality, as well as economic development. And of course, he's authored a number of scientific article books, including this very last book, The Globalization of Inequality, we are going to discuss tonight. In addition, he's also extremely active in international development community. He's lecturing and advising leading international agencies, not only the World Bank, and a number of foreign governments. So without further ado, I would like again to warmly welcome Professor François Bourguignon and give him the floor for the presentation of his book. Then we'll hear our speakers or commentators, Himnshu from JNU, Professor Surinder S.Jodhka from JNU as well, and Dr. Bruno Dorin from the CSH itself.
The reason why I entitled this book, The Globalization of Inequality, is really threefold. The first thing is that inequality may be seen at the global level. We are many inhabitants on this earth, and it may be interesting to look at the inequality among all the inhabitants of the globe, rather than to focus on the inequality in one specific country or another, or in one specific area. We are living at a global time, so let's look at inequality in a global way. But globalization of inequality, when we talk to people, has another meaning. Basically, people say, oh, I see what you mean. You mean that in all the countries, inequality is going up. And this is a kind of global phenomenon, because it is taking place in all countries. And this is not completely true, but partly true. It is true that in many countries, we see, we know, we feel that inequality is increasing. And maybe those countries are simply the front runners in terms of inequality. It's taking place in the United States, which is a country where there's been most talking about it, but maybe the United States, after the United States, it will be in other countries. It started in Europe, maybe it will start in other countries with the same kind of intensity as in the US. So this is really the first perspective on the globalization of inequality. The second perspective is about globalization itself. If we observe changes in the level of global inequality or in the level of inequality in some nations, is it possible to relate those changes to the globalization phenomenon? In other words, globalization of inequality may be the result of globalization. Is it the case or not? When you talk to people about globalization, many people will tell you globalization is a terrible thing because it is making rich people richer and poor people poorer. Is it true or not? And the third perspective is the fact that today, at a time where a global community is trying to form, inequality is becoming a global concern. When we talk about poverty in the world, when we talk about the Millennium Development Goals to reduce poverty, and we discuss about the way in which those Millennium Development Goals will be replaced by the Sustainable Development Goals at the end of this year, we have a global concern. And if this is okay, then the globalization of inequality means that inequality at this stage must at least partly be considered at the global level. And then at the global level, what can we do? What kind of policy can we implement? And what I want to insist upon is the fact that over the last 20, 25 years, we are witnessing a reversal in historical trends. On the one hand, global inequality, that is inequality among world citizens, after almost 2 centuries of increase, is going down for the first time over the last 20 years. And it is going down big time. So this is something which is quite notable. And the second reversal in historical trend is the fact that in many countries where over a long time inequality had remained more or less stable, in particular since the end of World War II, we observe that inequality is increasing again. And I want to give evidence of this, and I will start with global inequality, that is inequality among all the world citizens, and you can see immediately that this global inequality is combining 2 types of inequality: inequality between countries, across countries, the fact that India has a lower level of income of its inhabitants than the United States or than France, but also combining the inequality within India. The fact that some people in India have much less than other people, and that some people in France have much less than other people in France. So we're combining inequality within countries with inequality between countries. Now, when we do that, what is the kind of evolution that we get? This is the evolution of the historical period. This is taken from an old paper of mine with an economic historian, Christian Morisson, that we wrote a long time ago, where we try to get an estimate of the way in which global inequality had changed in the world since the beginning of the 19th century, that is the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And not surprisingly, we find that inequality has been increasing continuously, and this is a very normal process. I mean, first England is is taking off with the Industrial Revolution. Very soon some European countries, including France, are joining. Then later on, United States and the other former colonies of the UK are moving up. At a later stage, it is Japan. So we have this process by which, country by country, we see people who are starting to develop at a very quick speed, and other countries which are remaining on the starting line. And this is what we observe here. The red curve corresponds to a coefficient which is used to describe inequality, the Gini coefficient. And this is a coefficient which is between 0 and 100%, 100% being maximum inequality. This is when one individual would get all the income in a society, and 0 when everybody has the same income. And if you can read this chart, it starts at 50% in 1820, and it ended up at 66 in 1982. To give you an idea about what the level of inequality is in a few countries, today in France, the Gini coefficient would be 0.30. In Nordic countries, where we have the lowest level, it would be around 0.26, 27. And in countries which are the most unequal in the world, Brazil, South Africa would be around 0.60. So you see that in the world we have more inequality than in more or less in any country in the world. We had the recent period, and of course the recent period is, we can do much better work in terms of statistical precision, because we have, we observe all the countries. You know that when you look at the 19th century, many countries were simply inexistent. So what could you say in the 19th century about inequality of the level of GDP per capita in Rwanda or even in Laos? Okay. So because of that, behind this red curve, the dotted curve, there are a lot of rough approximations, but we have been able to show that these approximations would not change the general message. In the recent period, we can rely on much better data. In particular, it is the case that in, I would say, 80–90% of the countries, or at least in countries covering more than 90% of the world population, we have surveys taken regularly to measure the level of income of the people, of households. And all the analysis is based on those surveys. And what you can see is that over the last 10 years, from 1990 to 2010, there is a huge drop in inequality. There is a discontinuity between the two curves, basically because the methodology is not the same. We are not using the same sample of countries. We are not using the same kind of approximations in the recent period because we don't need to. But forget about the discontinuity, which is making the two curves incomparable in 1990. What is important is really the movement, the evolution, and we have a big drop taking place after 2 centuries of increase. And the drop is really quite substantial. You see that this corresponds more or less to little more than 5 points of the Gini coefficient. And if you look at the dotted line, you see that in order to increase inequality by 5 percentage points, it took more or less 1 century, from the beginning of the 20th century to almost the end of the 20th century, to increase inequality by 5%. So in 20 years, the global economy has erased almost 1 century of increase in inequality, which is quite remarkable outcome. So this is the first reversal. The second reversal is about what is going on within countries, national inequality. And let me start by developed countries, because this is probably what has been most discussed and commented. And on this chart you have the evolution of the Gini coefficient again in various countries. You have various bars. The first bar corresponds to, let's say, 1985, 1995, 2005, and the last bar, the light bar, corresponds to the last data available 2010 or 2011. And if we look at the most emblematic country, which would be the United States here, you see that you have a continuous increase in the Gini coefficient in the United States. This is the Gini coefficient of disposable income after taxes, transfers, etc., per consumption unit, or per what we call adult equivalent, taking into account the composition of the family. So this is a rather precise welfare concept, and we see that inequality has gone up from more or less 0.33 or 34 in the mid-80s to 0.38 in the end of the 2000s. But this increase, we find it in UK, we find it in Japan, we find it in Canada, we find it in Italy, we find it in Germany, even though in Germany the level of inequality is less than in the United States. We find it, France from that point of view is a country which is slightly atypical, because you see that the inequality was more or less constant with a drop in the mid-90s, between the mid-80s and the mid-2000s, and then lately inequality started to increase more significantly. And what is quite surprising in this chart is this part, which corresponds to the Nordic countries. Here we have Sweden, Denmark, Finland, and you see that in those countries which are known for their egalitarian culture or philosophy, it is quite interesting to see that there too inequality has increased very substantially. Look at Sweden, which was below 0.20 in the 20% in terms of the Gini coefficient, is now at 27 or something like that. What do we have in the case of developing countries? So if I look at Asia first, it goes from the mid-80s to the the end of the 2000s by a 5-year tranche. And here again we see that in some countries we have huge increase. Of course, the well-known case is China, where we see this increase in the Gini coefficient from 32 here to 43 today. But it is the same thing in Bangladesh. Here we have India, especially India, the urban India. I will come back to that in just a moment. Indonesia, and in those countries, Pakistan, Philippines, Thailand, Vietnam, not very much is happening. But I'll come back to that a little later to mention or to suggest that we don't see very much happening because there are other things happening behind the scene. If we look at India as a special case, this is a chart which is taken from a very nice database called the Chart Book of Economic Inequality, which has been put together by Tony Atkinson and Salvatore Morelli. And here we have various aspects of inequality in India. First, if we look at per capita expenditure, this is a green curve. We see that in the recent past, since the end of the 90s, the end of the 80s until now, there is an increase in the Gini coefficient from more or less 30 to 34. So this is less than what we observe in the US, but definitely this is a significant change. Here we have the change in the inequality of earnings of wage workers. And you see that, again, there is a big increase, almost 10 points in the Gini coefficient. So this is not an issue about who is working, not working, and whether there is a rent, profit, or rents in the income of a household. This is what is going on, the inequality among workers. The red curve corresponds to the drop in the number of the proportion of poor people, and this is essentially the result of, because the poverty line is fixed, it is the result of growth in the Indian economy, which has been very fast over the last 20 years. And at the bottom, we have the same thing as the top 5%, except for the fact that it is the top 1%. This is taken from tax statistics in India, which have been put together by Abhijit Banerjee and Thomas Piketty several years ago. And the series stops in 2000, because this is a paper, and the paper is already old. What you see that since 1980 until 2000, we have a significant increase by 5 percentage points in the share of total income going to the top 1%. Yet we observe that some countries which are known to be doing well, countries which are called the donors, darlings, like Uganda, Ghana, Tanzania, Ethiopia. In those countries, we observe that inequality is increasing. Data in those countries are correct, and I think that we may be confident, but the picture is certainly much more complex than elsewhere. And in the Middle East, we observe a rather surprising stability, even in countries like Egypt, even when we don't take into account the recent revolution. A lot of shocks have hit the Egyptian economy, and we see very little changes in equality. But the point I want to emphasize is the following. In all these countries, we are basically missing the top of the distribution. When you go to interview people who live in the top 1% or the top 0.1%, it is very difficult to get information. When you knock to the door, most likely you will be thrown out. And because of that, those people simply don't appear in the samples on which the surveys, our estimates rely. And at the same time, there is something very interesting in those countries. It is the fact that the evolution of the labor share of GDP, which is not easy to estimate, but we can estimate that, is the same as in developed countries. It goes down. So this suggests that the same phenomenon of concentration of income on the rents from land, the rent from real estate, or the rent from capital, in the profits, is taking place in those countries. And we cannot exclude the hypothesis that if we were able to take into account those incomes, accruing, of course, to the richest people, then inequality would be also increasing in those countries. But this is something which we can only state as an hypothesis and nothing else. Now, let me get to the next topic, which is a reflection about whether globalization is the culprit of all this, is behind all what we observe. And we have to look at globalization from 2 points of view. What is, or what may be, the impact of globalization on inequality between countries? And from that point of view, there is little doubt that the very fast growth in Asian countries like India, China, has been very much linked to the expansion of foreign trade, and in particular the expansion of trade with developed countries. This is definitely true in China since the middle of the 80s, and in India, the opening up of India is taking place in the early 90s, later than China, as a matter of fact, copying, imitating China, and very much of the expansion has been linked to this, very much of the growth in those economies has been linked to this expansion of trade. Now, if this is the case, we can say that the North-South catching up of emerging countries is partly based on globalization as this expansion of trade and foreign direct investment. And this globalization through Asian countries had spillovers on the rest of the world. And it is the case that the very fast growth that we observed since the early 2000s in Latin America and Africa is due to trade with the emerging countries, in particular China, but also India, and in particular trade in commodities, and the fact that primary commodities have seen their price increasing quite a lot over the last 15 years. Now, the oil price has just gone down a few months ago, but until the end of 2014, more or less, it was very, very high. And the terms of trade, that is, the way in which those countries can exchange their exports of commodities for imported manufactured goods, these terms of trade improved quite a lot for those countries. And because of that, they benefited from the growth of the Asian countries. And for the first time, really, since the end of the 60s and middle of the 70s, we saw a convergence between all the developing world and the richest part of the world. And globalization is part of the story. Another point which is quite obvious, and I'm always very surprised not to see that point made more systematically. When you think about globalization, who is responsible for globalization? Who is taking the initiative for restructuring the geographical allocation of tasks in companies? These are the companies. These are the executives in those companies. And if they do that, simply because this is increasing their profit. So, by definition, globalization must be increasing the profit made by all those companies which were already multinational or which are becoming multinational. And this naturally should contribute to more inequality at the very top for the capital owners and maybe also for the executives, for the CEOs, who are responsible for this strategy. And this may explain the surge in the top 1% income in many countries. And this may be directly the result of globalization. Finally, a very important phenomenon behind the increasing inequality in the labor market is the technical progress. We have all gone through the IT revolution, and it is true that this digital era that we have entered into has modified the demand for various types of workers, reduced the demand for unskilled workers in the first stage, and favoring, or more exactly, increasing the demand for skilled workers able to use this kind of technology. And maybe in the second stage, because they substituted to these medium-skilled workers, they substituted to this kind of routine task, which is not requiring too much manual operation. So these are typically the medium-skilled workers, may have been displaced by this technology. So technical progress certainly has played a huge role in all this. It has also contributed to increasing the profits made by many companies. Now, is this part of globalization or not? Technical progress is global. And computers are, and iPhones or smartphones are everywhere in the world. And from that point of view, we have something which is truly global. Now, is it the result of globalization, or does it come from heaven? Maybe part of it is coming from heaven. But another part is certainly coming from the fact that companies, in front of increased competition due to globalization, are trying to invest as much as possible into R&D, research and development. And by doing that, they are accelerating the process of technical progress. And this means that if we are not able to control the increase in inequality, then I'm afraid that we may be causing a stop in the rather favorable evolution of global inequality, of the global economy, which is a growing global economy with less and less inequality. So what can we do at the global level? I would say that there is any doubt that the catching up of northern countries by emerging countries, in Asia in particular, will continue. Even though the growth will go down, is going down in developed countries, those countries in the south, in Asia, have enough internal potential for growth to continue growing. The internal market in China, internal market in India is sufficiently large for strategies that would move in China from export promotion toward the internal market to generate sufficient growth. Now, So when this is done is another story. For the last 10 years or so, the Chinese leadership is trying to do that, or at least there is a debate within the Chinese leadership to move in that direction. But it is possible. It is simply a question of political will. And if the growth rate goes down too much in China, then it is quite clear that this will be the solution. So it is, without any doubt, the case that this catching up process will continue. Things are not that clear for the poorest countries, which are basically African countries. They have been able to take advantage of favorable terms of trade, favorable commodity prices. If commodity prices stay where they are, then the engine of growth that they had in the past 15 years will disappear, except if the demand for their commodities, the volume of the demand is increasing. But we are in countries where the labor force is growing at the rate of 2.5%, where in the next 30 years, 1 billion more people will be in those economies and will be requiring jobs. It is not possible for those economies to provide those jobs, basically living on the rent coming from primary commodities. They have to find another growth engine, in particular being able to export manufactured goods or being able to save on imports of manufactured goods or save on imports of agricultural products. But something has to be done, and for the moment it is not clear that this engine of growth is present. It has to be engineered, and from that point of view there is a concern. So to say that everything is fine and the process of declining global inequality is irreversible would be idealistic. We have to make sure that the poorest countries are able to continue growing at a rate which at least be higher than rich countries, and possibly will be at least at the same level as emerging countries. Now, the way in which this can be done, there are various ways. I will not insist on this. Official development assistance or development aid is important, but it's not the only thing. There is a huge debate on the effectiveness of aid, and with the Sustainable Development Goal, this and the next conference in Addis Ababa, all this discussion will start again. Many reforms are necessary, but it is definitely the case that those countries cannot do without this kind of financing. But it is not sufficient. Then we have to think about how they can be helped through trade preferences, through industrial policies that would be supported by developed countries, by their by donors. All this has to be rethought, and to make sure again that we don't have these divergences. Within countries, the forces behind globalization, which possibly produce more inequality, will remain. The globalization process is far from over. There are still many things that can be done by companies becoming truly not multinational but a-national, becoming operating in the world without really any specific consideration for the nationality, for their nationality, and for the nationality of the countries where they're operating. So this will continue, and because of that, there will still be forces toward more inequality. As I said before, protectionism is not a solution, because it will stop the global growth, and as a matter of fact, it would not be very favorable to many people in developed countries. But on the opposite, protectionism is probably something which is absolutely necessary for some developing countries. Probably not anymore for the Chinas and Indias of the world, but certainly yes for the Rwandas and the Senegals of the world. So we should not say protectionism is really bad and we should not use that word. No, I mean, this is a policy like industrial policies or important policies, which we have seen, the result of which we have seen in the past, and this certainly must be maintained. Regulating or reversing some aspect of regulation is something important in the financial sector. We have seen the terrible impact of the financial crisis of the 2009. Unfortunately, I'm not sure that we will not see something similar in the coming years. So there is definitely something to be done. There has been some progress in regulating the financial sector. Is this enough? This is not key. There is also there is strong recommendation which was made at some stage by the IMF to developing countries to open up their capital accounts or to open up to capital movements with the rest of the world. Fortunately, not many countries have done so. And because of that, they were somewhat isolated from the recent crisis. But they will not be able to resist for a very long time. China is thinking very much about becoming a financial place in that part of the world, in the Asian part of the world. And already China, there is a lot of capital movement in and out of China, which may be called in some cases capital flight. So these issues are present. This means that it will not be possible for big emerging countries not to consider seriously the regulation of the financial sector in the years to come. So this recommendation applies also to those countries in order to avoid the inequality impact of the financial sector development. In developing countries, globalization is likely to reinforce the concentration toward capital and skilled labor. In the, I was referring to Kuznets a little earlier, and this inverted U curve, and the descending part of the inverted U curve corresponds to the moment where growth in a country is sufficiently rapid to absorb the labor force, which is in the informal sector, in the backward sector of the economy. And at that time, the backward sector is shrinking, and this is the reason why inequality in those economies is going down. What we observe in several countries lately is the fact that growth is fast, but job creation is slow. And many people, including in India, are talking about jobless growth in the same way as in the US. Not a long time ago, people were talking about jobless recovery. And this is really a concern, because this may be linked to technical progress, it may be linked to the fact that we are going to a new world where the technology will be definitely requiring much and less employment. And this means that this descending part of the U curve, of the inverted U curve by Kuznets, may not take place, in which case then inequality might keep growing in developing countries. When we talk about redistribution policies, there are two ways we can look at redistribution policies. And the distinction I want to make, the more I go, the more I find it absolutely fundamental. People will see redistribution basically on an ex post basis. The economic phenomena play their role, income is generated, and then the state comes and takes some income from some people and give it to some other people. Taxes on the one hand, transfers on the other. This is good in the sense that this is definitely reducing inequality. This is bad in the sense that this is definitely reducing the incentives of people to accumulate savings, to undertake new projects or possibly even to work. So there is a limit. I'm not saying that any tax is bad. There's simply a limit to what taxation can do and to the kind of correction that is possible through taxation. Having said that, there is room in developed countries for increasing taxes if we are able to solve the problem of the mobility of people and capital, and some measures have been recently taken that go in that direction. There's still a long way to go, but we may be somewhat hopeful that something good is going on in that direction. And in developing countries, we have to stress the fact that taxation is very low. Probably the only developing country where taxation is high is Brazil, and it is not that progressive. China has some taxation. India has a very, very low tax rate overall. So there is room for increasing taxes without the threat or the risk that people will move immediately to the neighboring country where there will not be a tax. And there is, in all those countries, given the way in which payments function through bank accounts, through debit cards, etc., even through smartphones, it is possible for the administration to follow and to monitor the income of the people, something which was not possible 15 or 20 years ago. So the potential exists and it should be used. Having said that, however, we have to realize that the best way to reduce inequality is to work on the opportunities. Equality opportunities, that is the next ante. It is before the economic mechanisms play their role. It is to provide to people the right human capital, the right education, the right access to credit, the right access to healthcare, and in order to build their human capital, in order to equalize human capital. In India, we know that there is a tremendous inequality in terms of the quality of education, even at the primary level. But I would say that in France, there is also a huge inequality in the secondary schools. When we look at the result of a survey like PISA, which is looking at the way in which 15-year-olds answer some mathematical questions or to understand, to comprehend the text that they have to read, we observe in the case of France a huge disparity between the top and the bottom of the distribution. And more than that, we observe that this disparity is increasing, which is preparing for more inequality in the future. This is something which can be done and which, independently of globalization and all what is going on in the world, will contribute to not only more equality in the future, but, and this is the most important point, will contribute to more efficient economies. Because better educated people are more productive and will be contributing to the growth. If people have access to credit to start small businesses, good ideas will be implemented, and this will be contributing to faster growth. And this complementarity between equity, the equality of opportunities and efficiency is something essential. This has been the topic of a report which I supervised while I was in the bank in 2006, which was called Equity and Development, and the main argument was exactly that. You may want to pursue equity because it is a good thing per se, but you may also want to pursue equity instrumentally because this is improving the way in which an economy functions. And from that point of view, I think this is what I believe a powerful message that should be taken from the whole analysis in that. Let me conclude quickly. Globalization is a positive sum game with possibly adverse distributional impact on national economies. We have seen that. Now, growing inequalities in national economies may be a bad thing for those economies, because at some stage this will have a negative impact on the economy. This will have a cost on the economy. And at the global level, if there is too much inequality in several national economies, this may be a break, this may be a constraint for further progress in globalization and in expanding the global pie, if I can use this analogy. So, because of that, we certainly want to avoid this increase in national inequalities. Now, there is no reason to be passive. We have just seen that if we correct market failures through regulation, we will be enhancing the efficiency of the economy and we will be equalizing incomes. We have just seen that a more equal distribution of opportunities is efficiency enhancing and at the same time equalizing incomes. So there are things that can be done in all countries and they should be done. And again, to come back to my initial point, we have to remember that inequality has become a global concern and we have to act in agreement with this principle. Thank you very much.
So thanks, Professor Bourguignon, for having accepted to be amongst us today at CSH and tomorrow at GNU. It is really a great opportunity for us to interact with you and learn from you. François Bourguignon, I must confess that your name is very sympathetic to me since I started learning economics. Bourguignon means indeed in French, from Burgundy. And I'm native from Burgundy, South Burgundy, where I grew up happily in a very small Romanesque village of the 10th century, surrounded by nature, small farm, which have almost disappeared today, vineyard of Chardonnay and lush pasture for breeding the French cattle, Charolais, as we pronounce in South America today. So, Professor Bourguignon, my very first and important question to you is, are you native from Burgundy? Or do your family have a very special connection with Burgundy? This question puzzled me for about, let's say, 2 decades. My second big question relates to the book you have presented today, which will in fact be released within 1 month. And you may notice soon that this question is not totally disconnected from the Burgundian countryside I was quickly describing a few seconds back. So, if I'm not wrong, in your research and writing, you study inequalities without showing and emphasizing the wage gap between farm workers and the other. I would like to know why. The study of this gap is indeed rather common in what we can call today the structural transformation or modern growth paradigm in economics. The literature on the structural transformation is vast, from Lewis or Kuznets, you mentioned, in the 50s, to the French Sobey in the 80s, or much more recently, Lynn Roddick or Timmer. This literature questions mainly the transfer of labor from agriculture, called the traditional sector, to the non-agricultural sector, called the modern sector. You also say today for agriculture, you employ the word backward sector. Don't you think that studying the speed of this transfer of labor, as well as the gap between farm and non-farm labor productivity, cannot shed important additional light on your own long-term observation and conclusion on world inequality, both between countries and within countries? As Lagakos and wrote years back in the American Economic Review, understanding why productivity differences in agriculture are so large compared to those of the non-agricultural sector is at the heart of understanding world income inequality. I believe so. Let me summarize 3 papers published very recently in 2 well-known mainstream economic journals, the Quarterly Journal of Economics and the American Economic Review. All these 3 papers discuss the agricultural productivity gap, or the rural-urban gap, as it is also called. This gap suggests that labor is greatly misallocated across sectors. Golin, Lagakos and Paul took a step back and asked how much of this gap were artifacts of mismeasurement. After working carefully with census data and 10 household expenditure surveys, excluding unfortunately big Asian agricultural producers, And considering sectoral differences in household works and human capital per worker, as well as alternative measures of sector output, they found that a puzzling large gap remained. About 2000, it is not very clear in the picture. Meanwhile, Young found that the urban and rural gap account for 40% of the mean country inequality and much of its cross-country variation after having constructed comparable measures of inequality and migration for 65 developing countries using data from demographic and health survey. He also observed equal rural to urban and urban to rural flow of young workers despite much lower income in rural areas, which suggests a world where the population sought itself out geographically on the basis of its human capital and skill. This theory of self-selection was formalized by Lagakos and Wolff in a general equilibrium Roy model, in which preferences featured a subsistence food requirement, inducing workers who are relatively unproductive in agriculture work to nonetheless select into the agricultural sector in poor countries. When parameterized, the model predicts much larger cross-country productivity differences in agriculture than in non-agriculture, as well as a large wage gap between farm and non-farm workers. So these results are in contrast to other papers, which argue, for instance, that the agricultural productivity gap is mainly due to barrier to the adoption of intermediate input in agriculture, or farm size distortion that create a misallocation of resources from large farm to small farm. So Lagakos and Wolff model is convincing, but as the authors themselves note, it does not explain large cross-country productivity differences, either of a general or agriculture-specific nature. But they make two important observations. First, self-selection seems at least as important as the effect of land per worker, a parameter that increases the overall explanatory power of their model. Two, self-selection and land as a fixed factor are complementary mechanisms. In my own paper with Jean-Charles Bourguignon, you know, Professor Bourguigon, we go a step further on the land per worker parameter without postulating, as many do and maybe you too, that non-agriculture can everywhere free labor from agriculture, as happened in the rich countries. Instead, we show that economy, land, and labor endowment conjointly govern, to substantial extent, the enlargement of farm and their mechanization. In many developing contexts, as we demonstrate, land per worker actually decrease as labor in agriculture continue to increase, which further widens the income differences between farmers in developing country and those in developed country, in which land per worker is much higher and still growing. And within country now, very low and decreasing land endowment per agricultural worker widen their income gap with non-agricultural workers, a gap that self-selection may increase to a great extent. I call this later pathway the Lewis trap, and it is in this trap where most Asian countries seem embarked upon it for the past decade, and maybe soon sub-Saharan countries. My semi-final question refers to the future. What could we do for decreasing inequalities? Your answer, and like Stiglitz in his 2012 book, The Price of Inequality, or even Piketty. So your answer remains very mainstream. It bets, all in all, on the neoclassical growth theory, which states that, first, countries with access to identical technology should converge to a common income level. Second, countries that are poorer and have higher marginal productivity of capital should grow more rapidly in the transition to the long-run steady states. And three, open global economy, access to foreign capital and foreign markets should strengthen the convergence. So you advocate, as many other mainstream economists do, to equal as far as possible the chance of every world citizen to compete fairly on the global market. In other words, you may advise, please correct me if I'm wrong, to bet on education, health, market infrastructure, fiscal harmonization, and so on. So this is, of course, extremely important. But it may be far to be enough, even in the long run, to see a general convergence of income. As far as I'm concerned, since land cannot be indefinitely accumulated and like capital, and since 100 million of rural workers can hardly all move to cities job, especially in highly population regions such as Asia today and Africa tomorrow, I would also recommend a complete rethinking of the place and role of agriculture in the economy. In this future place, very small-scale farmers in particular will get revenue not only from the vital communities they provide to humanity, but also from the environmental services of local and global importance they can provide better than anybody else, provided the yield and productivity gains are above all based on complex and knowledge-intensive agroecological technology and practices, and not on an increasingly costly and polluting industrial input like those today of what is called modern agriculture or high-tech agriculture, either in France or in the US. By the way, and this is my quick last question, where stand exactly the public environmental good in your thought of inequality? Do you think there is any connection between this increase in inequality on the one hand and the depletion of natural resources and services on the other? Did you study, or do you plan to study this connection, if any? Do you think that protecting the environment may be a great opportunity for reducing poverty and inequalities, especially between, on the one hand, the 100 million of very poor small-scale farmers stuck in agriculture, because this is the least worse, and the other, the rest of the society?
This question, which is the easiest one, is that I'm not from Bolivia. But my name most likely comes from the Spaniards who occupied Flanders at the time of the occupation of Flanders by Charles the Quint. And but I like Burgundy. And for one, I had a house in the north of Burgundy, in Château. Okay, so let's get to serious stuff now. Now, I mean, I must say that I'm very grateful for all the points that you raised, and tend to agree with most of them. I deal with some of them in the book. I could not deal with them in the presentation, even if the presentation was long. But let me say a few words on those various points. About Bruno's question about the wage gap, I mean, basically the rural-urban or agricultural, non-agricultural gap, and the role it plays in inequality. I mean, this is a topic I worked on a lot about. And I remember to have written a paper, as a matter of fact, with the same Christian Morisson, which was about the way in which inequality within a country, at the level of the country, was related precisely to the gap between agriculture and the rest of the economy, and we found a very strong relationship. And I'm very, very sympathetic to this issue of what, I mean, I mentioned that at the end of my presentation. The Louis Kuznets story, and as a matter of fact, Louis even refers to Marx and to saying that his view is almost a classical view of development. The successful part means that there is enough demand for labor in the non-agricultural sector to absorb the farmers who are the least productive in agriculture. On paper, this works quite. And in history, it worked well in most OECD countries. But as I said at the end, we seem to be in a kind of a trap where this process does not work anymore. It does not work anymore for there are two possible reasons. One is either the non-agricultural sector is not growing fast enough, or it is growing fast enough, but with technology which is less and less labor intensive. And because of that, we are left with indeed a huge part of the population which is in poverty and for which it will be extremely difficult to find a solution. When referring to my time in the bank, and they will say that I'm always referring to the World Development Report, but not the last one, but the penultimate one I supervised was on agriculture. And the main issue was exactly that, was exactly to say, look, there are those people in subsistence farming or slightly commercialized farming. Those people are the poorest people. They will not be, it will not be possible to absorb them in the non-agricultural sector. What do we do with them? Then this is where gain in productivity are important, at least if they are not too bad for the environment. And most of the report was really about what to do about this. So I'm definitely quite aware of this issue, and this is one of the reasons why inequality might remain rather high in many countries, and the reason why many countries might remain with a rather large so-called labor surplus. These issues are there, and I didn't say at any moment that they would solve by themselves. You said that I was suggesting mainstream solutions. I'm not. I never said that convergence was something that would happen. I'm simply observing the fact that in the next decades or so, it is likely that emerging countries will continue growing faster than developed countries. Whether at some stage they will reach the level of income of these countries, I have no idea. I don't think it will be possible, honestly, because of the last point that you made, because of the environmental constraints. That at some stage will be, at the time of Malthus, the fixed factor was land. At the global level, land is not anymore a fixed factor. It is not a factor which is important. Today, the fixed factor is environment. And because of that, it might not be possible to imagine that the beautiful, marvelous world described by mainstream economists of convergence toward generalized prosperity will happen. I think so. I share your interrogations and to some extent your pessimism. But this does not mean that we cannot improve things in the 2-3 decades to come.
So much. I think it was really very, very fascinating. I think in 1 hour or 1.5 hours, I think we feel like we've already read the book, and this was absolutely fascinating. I mean, so much in that presentation, so dense and still so accessible, so vast and still so kind of precise. So thank you very, very much for giving this presentation. I've learned a lot today. At some level, we are also, in a sense, becoming increasingly, in a sense, uncritical is the wrong word, but we seem to think that where we are speaking from. But I think inequality is a much bigger historical question which all of us know. And as you rightly, repeatedly mentioned, that this has political dimensions, it has social dimensions, it has cultural dimensions, it has global dimensions, etc., etc. But I think there is also perhaps, in a sense, how does one foreground this point that inequality is not simply an economic question, or it is not simply a kind of state-centric policy question. It's also above all a human question. And when we say human question, then I think one also needs to invoke many other questions One obviously is what Bruno was talking about, is environment. And because this is very, very central, the question of environment is very, very central, because the manner in which economics has been thinking about the world, or economics has been thinking about societies and nation states in the last 20, 25 or 30 years perhaps, it's around the notion of a consuming individual. It's a consumption, it's actually purely in economic terms that how much you can produce. Even services are being visualized or imagined in terms of commodities. Quality of services there's a better possibility of providing education, healthcare, etc., etc. But this is something which has to be provided in the market through some kind of exchange system. And I think this whole discourse also has its own historicity. I think that becomes very critical, and it's very evident from your presentation. It was very, very clear that you are aware of this historicity of this discourse also. The second point I want to come to, which is related to this, is that the moment you move out of the pure economic-centric or productivity-centric or commodity-centric, market-centric view of inequality, one comes into a different domain where you have what I call as qualitative dimensions of inequality, a qualitative perspective on inequality. Inequality is about valuing, not just about value in monetary terms. When we are talking about inequality, we are also talking about things like dignity. We are also talking about human beings and how they are being assessed. People kill themselves not because they are poor, not because they are starving, because they feel undignified. Right? So the question of gender, for example, becomes very critical. Question of race and caste acquires a new kind of life in the globalizing world where migrations are increasing so rapidly. So for example, if one has to think of, not really been to France much, but I'm sure Paris today is a city of migrants. Anywhere in the world, the number of migrants you have today is much larger, and migration is not simply a question of multiculturalism or having a policy of multiculturalism. It's a very hard, real, social, political, economic question, and we know how inequalities also overlap with racial questions. Not only in France, obviously in India where you have caste, and caste reproduces itself in many different ways, but also in other parts of the world where you have race or some other different ways through which these categories remain very central to the actual experience of inequality. Inequality is not simply a question of measurement, it's also a question of experience, question of emotional experience. And that was kind of a large canvas of questions. For example, in World Bank also there's whole discourse on exclusion. And exclusion is something which is now recognized by economists, but exclusion is not always measurable. Exclusion is not always manageable through redistribution. So there is also the whole kind of perspective through which we think about human beings that needs to be revisited, and I think the world today is aware of it. It's not like we are not aware of it, and many people have made us aware of it. Questions coming from feminist movements, questions coming from environmental movement, questions coming from, in India, say Dalits. All these people raise questions of inequality in a very different language, not simply a question of. So I think those are critical questions, and how does one, in a sense, engage with those? Not that what you have done is not valuable. Somebody like me should do that also, because this doesn't exhaust the whole sphere of inequality. I thought it's just kind of the final point that I have, which is not really either a question or a comment on your presentation, but I think this is something that we all need to think about. In the 19th century Europe, when inequality was a major concern, when you had people like Karl Marx, not only thought about inequality, not only studied inequality, but it also visualized a world which could take us out of inequality, or there was a kind of politics which was articulated around that time. That seems to be missing today. I think in the discourses on inequality also, that kind of utopianism or whatever you like to call it, I think there is something that we need to perhaps, how does one visualize a world which is beyond commodities? And unless we do that, even if we are able to have a parity, we will find very difficult to breathe. And that's already happening in cities like Delhi. If we can't communicate with each other as human beings, what's the point in having a life?
Professor S.Jodhka, thank you very much for your comment. So you're absolutely right in insisting about the other dimensions of inequality. In in the book, I am looking at some of these other dimensions. Maybe those dimensions which are somehow can be measured. So when you talk about inequality being the shame that people feel when they are poor, and we know that when we interview poor people, very often the first answer they give when we ask them, okay, how do you feel? Is we feel ashamed. Now, this is very difficult to measure, and we know this is part of the story. We know this is part of the issue of the inclusion-exclusion. But because the question I was asking in the book is there a change taking place in those dimensions? And I was revising the issue of security, the issue of environment, the issue of gender discrimination, ethnic discrimination, trying to see whether there was progress or not. And in some areas, we can say something. In gender discrimination, for example, in developed countries, there is no doubt that there has been a huge progress. Yet, the progress seems to have stalled for a while. The wage differential went down for a while, and now we seem to be in a situation where there is no change anymore. What is behind that? So, but would that be due to globalization? What is behind that? This is another story, and I didn't delve too much into that, but I agree that these are very important dimensions. One thing that you didn't mention, and I thought that you would, as a sociologist, is also the fact that inequality, when it is measured by economists who have those Gini coefficients, etc., this seems to be very simple figure. I remember discussions in China with Chinese leaders when I was explaining to them that inequality should not be going too far, because then there would be some problems and they would become inefficient. Then the question is, but how big the Gini coefficient should be before we start worrying? Okay, okay. Of course, the world is not like that, and one important issue in particular is that there is a measurement of inequality of what is observable, like income or consumption or wealth, but there is also a perception of inequality, which is extremely important. I mean, we may be living, there was this fascinating survey which was made several years ago by the foundation in France in association with Brookings institutions, where they interviewed people in various countries, asking them about whether the society where they were living was fair or not, and whether inequality had increased or not in their country. In the US, we'll not be surprised that people were saying, oh yes, we are living in a very fair society. I mean, the majority of people were saying that. In France, the huge majority of people were saying we are living in a very, very unfair society. In the US, when the people were asked whether inequality had increased over the last 10 or 15 years, people were saying, no, not really. Whereas, as a matter of fact, we have seen that it surged, okay? And in France, when people were asked whether inequality had increased, people said, oh yes, it became something completely unbearable. And you have seen the figures. Not very much has happened. I mean, something happened, but not very much. So, the perception of that is very important from a political economy point of view. The point that Professor Himnshu made, this is, of course, extremely important. And as economists, we would like to play with our figures and say that the world behaves as our figures would suggest that it does, but unfortunately this is not the case, and this means that there are these issues linked to inequality which are quite important.
It's also linked to globalization of the media, in the sense that
Right.
is that perception, everything is open.
Yeah.
So people see each other, that kind of also sharpens those perceptions of inequalities.
And for a very important phenomenon is the phenomenon of the super rich.
Yeah.
the super rich may represent a very, very, very tiny proportion of the population. And the fact that they are becoming richer, okay, maybe this is something ethically questionable, but this has almost no impact on the Gini coefficient. And yet, everybody is talking about those people. And the perception of inequality is very much linked to that. And from that point of view, the regulation of the financial sector, etc., has played a huge role. Then your point about utopianism. Yes, I wish we would be utopian. We are living in a world where there are various forces, where geopolitical forces are present, and I'm afraid that the idea that we can change that world by sheer will, by some community, is not. I mean, it is utopian, truly. I don't see how we can get there. And for a while, I would think that we have to take for granted that there are political economy games being played. If we are able to push toward more equity in the sense of equality of opportunities, etc., as I mentioned, and if we are successful in that, it seems to me that this is already a progress being made. But you are probably right in saying that this is too modest a goal, and that we should be more ambitious. But again, I mean, trying to analyze the world as it is, as it goes, I don't see clearly what can be done. But this may be discussed.
I'll not take much time. Thanks, François, for an excellent presentation. I think, being the last speaker, I've run out of my share of questions. But let me come back. Fine, but let me come with, while agreeing with both Surinder and Bruno. I think the point that I want to come back is the issue of globalization, because that I think is the central theme of your talk today. And you have given a long historical narrative to that. And so all your graphs more or less start from 1910 to over up to. So roughly like a century's snapshot has been given. And that is where I want to come back. I mean, how do you view or how do you look at the whole issue of globalization? After all, it is not just opening of trade. Globalization, when you're talking about countries over a period of time, you are talking about a lot of political economy questions. You are talking about political economy questions not just within the countries, the relationship between capital and labor, but also talking about the relationship between countries. And in that sense, I mean, if you look at the big picture that you showed, I mean, overall inequality been going up, and suddenly it starts falling after 1990s, it starts going down. What happens if you drop India and China out? What do you do after you drop India and China? What happens to the within equality and between inequality of the countries? Because some of the two countries which are big shares in that sense and which have grown really the fastest are also the highest weight in the total population that you're talking about. And if you draw those, then do you get the same kind of a picture or do you get a different kind of a picture? That's something that's an obvious question. But a much more interesting issue that we would like to do is that let me try and break down the entire inequality story into three phases of it. One is what you agreed with, and I have no differences in that after the Great Depression there is a decline in inequality, at least in the developed world, the big OECD countries, kind of period of flat inequality in those countries, and then there is a rise that happens after 1980s that goes up in all the countries. But this is also a period of Thatcherism and the Reagan's opening up, so-called deregulation of the financial markets. What was the motivation behind that? Was it simply a desire to open up the economy, or were there political economy reasons for that? How much was it linked to the 73 oil crisis, shifting away from the gold standard to a dollarization of the economy, and the dominant powers taking over of that? What was the role of the Washington consensus in that? I mean, were we going back to the same kind of a globalization? Because remember, pre-1940s, pre-Second World War countries, when the global trade was, the share of global trade probably in the world was as high as, and more higher, I mean, in fact higher than what it is today. But that was a trade that was determined by power relations between colonies versus those who were colonizing. Are we seeing a different kind of a way of, as this globalization? So globalization, I mean, I just want to kind of break it down for us, because globalization in that sense does mean giving more power to capital, but which kind of capital? Why finance? Why is there a restriction of movement of labor, for example? Much more easier for companies, for an Apple, to import Chinese laborers in the US and produce the same kind of produce. But why is it that exporting capital is much more easier than, say, importing labor and doing the same kind of a thing? And does it have an impact in the national economies? Because national economies are, after all, responding to what is happening to the global economies. Today, what you see in China is also happening to India. We didn't say much about it, but it's actually also happening. Some kind of suppression of labor laws, some kind of deterioration in the working conditions of workers in the rural areas as well as urban areas, because they're all becoming integrated in a part of a larger design where the global multinational companies are becoming the dominant players. The sovereign power of the states or the national countries, in that sense, is getting weakened. So, in that sense, is it just an economic issue, or there is a geopolitical angle to it? What we see in what is happening in Latin America or the period of the 1980s onwards, when there is a kind of the inequalities rising in the Latin American countries, again, this is not just an economic-wide impact. It is something being driven by what is happening in the global arena also. And how much role is being played by the big powers, the OECD countries, and how much the sovereignty which is there in the national countries to respond to fighting inequality is there. And that is an important question, because the last point that you mentioned is about redistributive policies. That is a question which I am always in favor of, redistributive policies. But again, does it basically skirt the real political economic question of the balance of power between capital and labor? Can India as a country, which has among the lowest tax rates, is in a position to raise tax rates without sacrificing its growth rate? Is it in a position, does it have the capacity to do that? Is there a position that is there in China to suddenly declare that we will not be party to the entire global value chain and we will try to do that? Is there a break-even point after which China starts saying that, or is there something which is, most of the smaller countries will not be able to do that? So in that sense, the globalization process itself needs to be broken down into different components of it. It is not a neutral economic process of just opening up of trade. It has implications in terms of how countries respond to each other, cooperate with each other, compete with each other, and the level of inequality in domestic countries is not just a result of what is happening to the globalization, but also this is reflecting to the global inequality concerns. Would like to have some kind of clearer understanding of this globalization process itself. Thanks.
Your point about India and China is very well taken. Thank you very much for mentioning that. It is true that in this evolution of the global distribution of income or welfare, China and India played a huge role, simply basically because they represent 40% of the whole world. So if something is happening in 40% of the world, this has an impact on inequality. So I am in another paper, I have some simulation where you do the same thing without China or without India, or assuming that China grows like the rest of the world, and India too, and you find different results, but over the last period, I mean starting in 2000 and something, then the drop in inequality is still there. Okay, so it doesn't start in 1990, but it starts later. And then it may be the case that it is not a trend reversal, simply because the trend reversal is the impact of China and India, but I tend to believe that the fact that 40% of the world population catching up with the richest part of the world, we cannot consider that this is an AP phenomenon. It is something fundamental. And I agree that this is a link to two countries, but two countries with very much diversity. Because we could also talk about the way in which in India the various states are moving up. And the same thing with the various provinces in China. So the point is well taken, but I don't think that this is completely making a vacuum of this story that I told. The reasons for this neoliberal term in the 80s. This is a very interesting and very difficult question. Several people have written about this. One, maybe two types of answers. One is the fact that after the war, in many countries, planning commissions, like the late planning commission in India, were extremely powerful. The state was extremely powerful. And in many countries, we could observe that the state was not doing very